The cloth slipped from my fingers as I shoved the blood-stained scrap through the bars. A guard's boot thudded, and the chamber froze. Guilt sat at the base of my tongue and pushed me forward. I did not hide that feeling, I acted on it. I knew the rules better than most. I had fastened keys to my belt and kept the ledger's margins neat, yet I let my hand move the way it did. The prisoner blinked and reached. The scrap landed at his palm. Someone shouted, "Stop him!" And the commander barked my name with the flat, measured cadence that makes men obey without thinking. In those 5 seconds I felt doubt harden into fear, and the tribunal's logic swung into motion around me. I am the jailer. I will say I am the one who did this, because I cannot let the ledger lie about my hands. I keep the brass key ring at my belt. I wear wool tunics patched at the elbow and leather gloves stained with oil and blood. I have a small cruciform locket that never comes off. I touch it when I think of mercy, that touches habit and confession at once. The tribunal called the chamber to order. The prisoner on the bench, ashen, hair-matted, pressed fingers to the scrap and mouthed a name I would not have expected to hear aloud. Why did you do it? The commander, he pointed the baton at my chest. His voice sliced across the benches. The word betrayal dropped like cold metal into the room. Guilt pushed me to answer with facts and actions rather than pleas. I gave him bread, I said. I folded the cloth around his wound. The commander did not ask for explanations. He stepped between the clerks and the veterans at the back. Bring the ledger, he ordered. A clerk moved with practiced fingers and produced a slim book. I watched the pages as if they might open a door back to an earlier choice. Records matter there. Ink can chain a man as surely as iron. The first witnesses were not kind to me. A veteran guard, Thomas, spoke with the bluntness of someone who had kept watch through winters. He patched the men without orders. Thomas eased bindings when the ropes cut skin. He let a prisoner sleep where others stood watch. Thomas, my name hard and deliberate. Jailer, each use of my title narrowed the space left for mercy. The ledger found little acts written in ledger hand. Dates, small favors, a pattern that looked like leniency. The clerk pushed the pages toward the commander. That was the second emotion shift. Uncertainty became accusation. I answered with a clean, measured voice. Thomas, I said, you arrested men the same way you beat them. You know how orders bend, why single me? Thomas's mouth tightened. He did not meet my eyes. Silence moved like a weight across the benches. The prisoner, his lips cracked, watched us with Hazal eyes that had not lost the habit of looking for faces that remembered names. The commander made the charge public then. He named the crime not as theft or treason but as a breach of ritual. A jailer who shows mercy undermines order. He told the hall, we are a tribunal. Our authority is fear and consequence. A single act of softness will spread. Let him answer here. He stepped back and raised the baton. Demonstrate fidelity, he said to me, and his voice contained no question. They carried the prisoner to the raised platform where punishments were shown. The floor had dark rings where people had knelt, and the torchlight caught old stains. I had stood on that platform 100 times, knotting ropes, setting hooks, following the manual of pain that the commander endorsed with a ledger and a ritual. My hands moved before my head agreed. I was ordered to perform. I was ordered to prove my fidelity. I thought of the scrap in the prisoner's hand and the bruise at his temple. I thought of my locket against my sternum and the sound the whistle made when I set it between my teeth. The commander watched with narrow brown eyes. I made a choice in the space between two breaths. I chose a less severe method. I tied a softer knot that would sting but not unmake the man's wrists. I struck the band with a measured motion but stopped short of the full arc that would have cut deep. The crowd reacted. Some officers' faces pinched like old leather. A young guard hissed, he cheats the system. The commander leaned forward and spoke into me the law I had bent. You know the penalty, he said. You know what leniency invites. That moment shifted me again. From guilt to a cold clarity that my choice would not save him. The prisoner, when he could breathe, spoke. He named a patron and an order that dragged the commander into the light. It was Marrow's token, the prisoner said. And he spoke a name of someone the commander had sheltered. The hall froze. The commander, who had held power as if it were a garment tailored to his bones, narrowed his eyes until the scar across his brow stood out like a ridge. You lie, the commander snapped. He raised the baton. Who gave you order? who named Morrow. His voice sought an ally among the officers. The ledger sat open like a witness. The prisoner fixed his gaze on the commander and said, "You remember the night in the East Wing?" "You do." That claim pulled oxygen from the room. A hush followed, and with it the third emotion shift. A trembling doubt moved through the tribunal, then a quick, sharp panic in the commander that he buried under doctrine. The trial turned inward. The commander tried to regain control. He pressed a senior guard, Arlen, to speak. Arlen had the square jaw and heavy signet that made him look older than his years. "Jailer, Arlen, we followed the code. You unmade a chain of command. You bent orders for a notion." He spat the last phrase as if it were a curse. Arlen's testimony struck at me because he had been my comrade on the rounds. He knew the angles of my shifts and the hours I had let men sleep when duty named wakefulness. When Arlen stepped forward, the guards moved and my keys were taken. Thomas reached for the brass ring, and fingers that had shared bread with me closed around the cold metal. They stripped the leather from my hands where the gloves hung. My uniform felt suddenly too large and too empty. The insignia fell from my belt onto the cobbles with the sound of a small, final bell. I did not resist. There was no point. That was another change, humiliation settling into resolve. I watched the commander as he watched the ledger. His mouth did not betray remorse. Instead, he tightened the law around my throat like an iron collar. "We will make an example," he said. "Order must be preserved." He ordered that I would demonstrate my fealty by administering the prescribed punishment in full. I was led to the center of the court beneath torches. The prisoner stayed seated until I approached. He did not ask for mercy. He looked at me and said, "You will be blamed for remembering me as a man." I had a brief exchange with the prisoner then. "Prisoner," I said, "tell me your name. Tell the commander who you are. Tell them what ties you hold." The prisoner whispered a name I had not known before, and his whisper reached the commander with the clarity of a bell. "Marius," he said, "Marius of the Eastern Watch." He sent me a thread. The commander flinched as if struck. The hall shifted, officers trading glances that sharpened into questions. The prisoner had given us a new fact that bent our map of guilt. "You lie again," the commander snapped. "You will not be allowed to trade accusations." But his voice had cracked the ritual. The crowd wanted order and control, and now it wanted to know what the commander had shielded. The commander pushed back with formal language about duty. "We will not permit deflection," he said. "You know the law." The jailer proved the breach. Punish him now. At that point I hesitated. I could comply and prove I would follow the chain. I had the whistle on a cord in my palm. I could blow and call for a different consequence, but I did not. Instead, I reached for the prisoner's bindings and cut them with the small blade I kept for rope work. I set his wrists free. I stepped between him and the commander and held my hands open. "Step back," I told the commander. "Let him go." 3 officers rushed. They shoved me aside and yanked the prisoner up by the elbows. Arlen caught my wrist with the force of a man who had learned how to break bodies without scarring his conscience. The commander barked orders that reshaped the hall into a shape of enforcement. "Take him down." The commander, break his defiance. A small riot of motion followed. Men grabbed the prisoner. I pitched forward and felt leather split under my palms. Pain rolled through my forearms where hands had clamped tight. The prisoner's face was calm in a way that undid me. He mouthed a single name and the sound lodged in my teeth. The crowd's anger became a physical weight that pressed against my chest. I tried to shout a warning, but Arlen's hand closed on my collar and squeezed until the words left me in a shallow breath. We left the chamber. The corridor carried the steady damp scent of stone and the iron tang of old blood. They took my keys officially. Thomas handed them to the commander, who put them into a small box as if the metal itself could be contained away from memory. I walked with my head down because there was nowhere else to look. Chains clinked at my wrists, not from the law but from the men who pulled them. I had been a sign of authority. They had turned me into evidence. The prisoner slipped away in the confusion or was dragged back. I cannot say which. I only know that a piece of cloth came loose and fell into a gutter, and I watched it twine with straw as if nothing had happened. That was the mid-chapter cliffhanger. Whether he escaped or was returned remained unresolved long enough to hang in my chest as a raw weight. In the dark of the corridor, the commander spoke once more. "Jailer, he said. You will confess here. You will tell us why mercy is your fault. His tone left no room for true speech. They placed me in a cell where the light came through a narrow slit and landed in a precise rectangle on the stone floor. A guard pushed a bowl of broth through the slot. The spoon clanged. I tasted the broth without hunger. The brass key ring was not on my belt. The locket at my throat felt like an accusation. I sat with my hands folded, palms raw from being gripped, and noted each small detail. The frayed stitch in my sleeve, the smell of candle wax, the thin, steady drip from a crack in the wall. I catalogued those things because cataloging is a defense. Then they brought witnesses. Thomas came first and stood at the bar. My name and the hours I had covered, the small favors he gave bread. Thomas, he eased rope. He allowed sleep. He made exceptions that made more men try to test limits. Thomas's cadence was precise. I answered briefly and cleanly. Thomas, I said, you beat a man for stealing bread last winter. You watched him in the frost. Did you not let your son trade a watch to save him? Thomas's jaw tightened and he did not deny it. Arlen testified next. He did not speak with passion. His lines were short and controlled. Jailer, Arlen, you broke protocol. You unmade a chain that keeps men from turning on each other. We followed procedure. You did not. The commander nodded. Each testimony tightened the screw of public opinion. I could see the way officers exchanged looks that decided my fate in the margins between phrases. Then the prisoner was brought back. If he had left at all, it had been brief. He stood and his hazel eyes found mine. He nothing at first. The commander demanded a statement. The prisoner coughed and produced the same small token I had slipped, a scrap of cloth with a loop of thread. He held it up so the light caught the fiber and said, he saved me when I had nothing. The simple sentence landed with more force than the ledger. The commander surged. He intended to crush this sentence with the machinery of ritual. We will have order, he said. Order is not sentimental. Explain why you did this, jailer. Tell us the reason for your compassion. I stood then and moved closer to the bars that separated the platform. I did not plead. I spoke with the slow precision I had used to lock cells for years. I cut his bindings because I could not watch a man be unmade for lack of a thread, I said. I did it because I had hands and a blade and he had none. The room answered with little noises, shifts, an intake of breath, the scratch of a quill. The commander, you will be punished for undermining the code. He gestured to two guards who stepped forward with the implements of the prescribed punishment. The hall prepared for the ceremonial enforcement of law. I felt every gaze as if it were a tool pressed to my skin. I did not beg, that was a choice. Instead, I reached out and touched the prisoner's forearm. My hand trembled. He looked back at me and mouthed. Go, he did not tell me to run. He me to carry the fact of his body out of that room, to let him be more than a ledger entry. His lips formed the word with patience. I obeyed the nature of that command rather than the law of the commander. They dragged me down to the antechamber. My uniform was gone. The leather straps were cut and folded onto a bench. Someone had placed my whistle on top. The commander looked at me, and then looked away as if the sight of me required a different kind of vision than his role allowed. He spoke quietly to Arlen. I heard the words like a directive, make certain he understands what he did. The commander, make certain others know the cost. They left me there, bare of insignia, marked where rough hands had gripped me. I ran my tongue along my teeth and tasted metal. The whistle lay cold against the bench. I pulled the locket from under my tunic and felt its cool weight. I set it back and breathed. My confession had not yet been spoken. I would write it later, when the pain had mapped itself into words. For now, the chapter closed with them taking my keys and the prisoner, or the absence of him, becoming the hinge the tribunal would hang its future on. A guard shoved the cell door and it clanged. The corridor swallowed the sound. My hands were empty of keys, but not empty of memory. I sat and pressed my forehead to the stone and listened for footsteps. Outside the ward, the commander whispered to someone I could not see. The final act of the evening was a sound, a lock turning, and then the echo faded down the hall. That click marked my ruin and the beginning of this confession. I would tell the ledger what my hands did, and I would not hide the exact motion of my blade when I cut the cord. I would name the men who took my keys. I would say the prisoner's name aloud, clearly, so the record would carry it forward. A distant footfall crossed the flagstones and someone called, "Bring the clerk's ink." A sergeant's hand closed on the scrap before I had the chance to hide it. Shame sat like a stone under my tongue. I felt it in the way my fingers cooled and in the way the brass ring at my belt bounced against my hip. "Hand it over," Sergeant Petrov barked. He held the cloth up between thumb and forefinger as men in the work detail froze, their tools hanging mid-swing. The scrap's dark smear glistened in the thin dawn. I had shoved it through the bars to buy a moment, and he had seized that moment away. The central problem was exposed in the yard. Showing mercy had become an accusation. I knew the rules. I had them burned into my knuckles from keys, straps, and long nights in cells. Yet that morning, mercy was the thing for which I would be judged. I am the jailer. I do not say it like an introduction. I say it like a fact of weight. Mid-30s, lean from constant labor, with a scar along my jaw and a permanent dusk of stubble. My leather gloves were stained. My brass keys hit the outside of my tunic. I smelled of cold tobacco and candle wax. I kept my eyes lowered by habit and by calculation. The memory of the cloth slipping from my fingers as I shoved the blood-stained scrap through the bars, an action from a night before, was not new. It had been recorded by Boots and by the clerk's ledger. The yard repeated the gesture and gave it a new consequence. The commander arrived before I could answer. He walked with a measured step, baton tucked under his arm like a statement. "Jailer," he said, and the word had no courtesy. Give me that. He did not ask. He took the scrap and read the stain as if reading a verdict. "You gave him anything?" The commander asked without waiting for me to lift my head. "No, Commander," I said. My voice was low. I folded my hands over the belt where the keys lay. The action was meant to steady me. I kept my eyes down and allowed my fingers to toy with a ring instead of looking at the commander. Petrov stepped in. He shoved it through the bars, sir. I saw him. He my name twice, and each time it sounded like a charge. Around us, workmen shifted. One dropped a plank with a dull slap. The first emotion shift came as accusation produced fear. My hands began to tremble. Fear is a concrete thing. My right hand almost dropped the whistle on its cord. My jaw clenched until the scar atched. The guards moved in to surround me, not for protection but to box me in. The commander unfolded the charges quickly. Mercy used to undermine a sentence, tampering with punishment, willful betrayal of duty, and he catalogued them like a ledger. We moved into the antechamber. The clerks were there, the paper smell of the court thick and dry. The court clerk, a thin man named Havel, flicked pages with the same mechanical motions he used to fasten bindings. He read aloud the list of accusations and then, without looking up, said, "Stand aside. Let the punishment be decided." He kept his voice neutral. The words themselves were the tribunal's machine. In the antechamber the second emotion shift occurred. Doubt curdled into resolve. Shame still pressed, but doubt about what I had done turned into a stubborn thread. I had acted according to a rule older than the commander's edicts. I had loosened a binding in one cell to stop a man from choking on his own vomit. I had hidden a scrap of cloth because a pulse still beat under another man's ribs, and because my hands would not let me watch that pulse be snuffed. Those were small, concrete acts. Fingers untying a rough knot, slipping folded linen into a palm. I rehearsed them in my head with the same clarity as a craftsman checking tools. The commander called for witnesses. He named me by title and by fault. He pointed his baton as if punctuating each syllable. "Jailer," he said again, "you know what mercy does in this yard. You know our law." He tilted his head and waited for me to say otherwise. "Commander," I said, "I know the rules. I know my duty." My sentence came out tight. I kept looking at the belt where the keys weighed down my hands. The tribunal announced ritual punishment on the dais above the yard. They used the word right and dressed it with ceremony, a public inversion meant to teach the rest. The clerks arranged the instruments not as tools but as statements, straps, iron rings laid like a formal set. The sentencing was a deliberate twisting of my role. Where once I unlocked suffering, now I was to become its steward. They moved me to the central platform at noon. The yard was cleared into a circle of faces. Soldiers, clerks, workmen, and the prisoner whose life had become the hinge of this moment. The prisoner Marek stood with his hands bound and a thread tied at his wrist. I had fed him a crumb of bread the night before when no one watched. That is a fact. That is a small, concrete action that contradicted orders. Marek had the look of a man used to being reduced to particulars. Bruises under his eyes, a shaved patch at the temple, the damp smell of straw in his hair. When he saw me, his eyes locked on mine with a recognition that had nothing to do with words. He mouthed a name, no sound but a movement. I felt my resolve shift again, from stubbornness toward a brittle clarity that this man's small signals could tilt the room. Strip him, the commander ordered. The command was simple and brutal. My hands moved before my head finished arguing. I unbuckled my belt and took off the stained gloves. I felt the leather slacken under my fingertips. The action was mechanical. Peel, fold, lay on the wooden bench, yet each motion forced my mind to watch what I had tried to avoid. I had to undress the man I had sheltered. I had to touch him where I had once smoothed a fevered brow. As I removed the prisoner's coarse linen, the guards watched for any hesitation. The court clerk recorded each motion with clacking ink. I felt every eye as a measurement. My hands trembled while I tied the new restraints. I tightened leather straps around Marek's wrists, clamped iron rings, and threaded a key through the final loop. My fingers remembered how to work locks. My hands had done this thousands of times. Marek, in a thin voice, "Jailer, you are shaking." He did not use my given name. He used my title the way one speaks an accusation or a prayer. Mary answered. I did not meet his eyes. I kept my face level and my hands controlled, breathed low. Look at me. The prisoner's small action undercut the commander's script. He reached beneath his shift and drew out a white thread looped on a folded scrap. He showed it openly, placing it on his palm as if presenting evidence. This, Marek, is what they gave me when I was taken. The man at the gate said keep it for luck. I kept it. He looked straight at the commander now. I did nothing with it. I have said my name. I have not lied. The thread was tiny and ordinary. It could have been a child's token. Yet the sight of it made the commander stall, the baton drooping for a half-beat. Around us, the guards shifted in their armor. Havel's pen scratched with renewed intent. The prisoner had performed an unexpected testimony. This was the mid-chapter twist. A small object that undermined the tribunal's supposed justification. It was a concrete object and a concrete statement. The guards exchanged glances. For a moment, the balance of authority trembled. The commander recovered quickly. He trimmed his words like a knife. Petty tokens do not overturn sentence. Jailer, continue. He pointed the baton underhand and the action snapped the air. The ritual demanded an obedience that made no allowances for doubt. That moment contained a rapid exchange. The commander ordered, continue. I hesitated. The sergeant repeated, do it now. Jailer, I paused longer. Marek, jailer, if you must. He trailed off. The court clerk hissed. This is unnecessary, the commander barked. Finish your duty. The sequence was 6 lines in quick succession. It tightened the room like a vise. This argument was the last pivot before the climax. My hesitation was not theatrical. My palms were sweating against the leather. I could feel the outline of each key through my tunic. Inside me, the emotion shifted again. Shame and doubt had yielded to a focused fear for action. Either I obey and break myself, or I refuse and break the tribunal. I had no illusions about consequence. The commander's doctrine did not tolerate dissent. His doctrine demanded cruelty as a mechanism of order. I made the choice. I unclasped the last ring and took the keys from my belt. I held them openly. For a second the keys were warm from my body heat, then cool in the morning air. I looked at Marek and then at the commander. I did what hands do when they decide. I moved toward Marek and, without speaking, worked the lock to loosen the new restraints. A gasp ran around the yard. Petrov lunged. You will not. He reached for my wrist. I pulled back from his hand and hooked the finger of the last key into the staple. The lock clicked. Marek's wrists slid free an inch. Then 2. I kept my hand steady. I set the key on the wooden bench and left it there. Stop him. The commander shouted. The guards surged. They did not surge with confusion. They surged with trained certainty. Their boots hammered the boards. But Marek did not run. He sat up straighter and touched his wrist where the thread was tied. He did not speak. The small token was in his palm and the yard watched it. Petrov grabbed for me and hit my arm. I felt the blow hard enough to sting. My face flared, but I did not speak. I braced my jaw and took a step back that left my shoulder exposed. The court clerk stamped a page as if to mark the moment. The commander raised his baton. There was a second where the baton came down, and where I had to decide whether to shield Marek or to obey. I moved before I could think. I surged between the commander and Marek. My shoulder took the baton first. The wood struck against my collarbone with a dull pain that went hot along the bone. I hunched over and one of my gloves fell to the floor. I smelled the iron of fresh blood at the corner of my mouth. "Jailer," the commander said, voice flat, "you have made your choice. You will pay for it in full." He did not shout, he pronounced. They executed the punishment as ceremony. They bound me, not only for restraint but for spectacle. The ritual inverted my duties. I, who had kept the keys, was stripped of them. They tied my wrists in the same pattern I had used on prisoners. The straps bit into my skin in the precise places where colluses had once formed. When they forced me to stand and watch, it was as if the tribunal wanted to ensure I learned what it meant to be made small. They marched Marek away after a cursory exchange. He did not struggle. Before they passed out of the yard, he turned his head once and mouthed, "Thank you, jailer." His lips moved. The word was small and precise. I felt both the sting of pride and the weight of consequence at the same moment. Those two sensations did not cancel. They layered. Out in the yard afterward, the commander addressed the assembled men. "Order must be preserved," he said, and he listed precedents, punishments, and fines. His language was dry and exact. He repositioned doctrine as if rearranging the stones of a foundation. They returned my keys to the clerk's chest and placed my gloves in a sealed cubby. My title remained above my bed, but the belt was not mine. The instruments heaped in the corner were the proof of lesson delivered. The aftermath was concrete. A missing belt, a waterless trough for a night, a bruise across my collarbone, and the clerk's ink, stamped record that would become part of the ledger. I was led back to my small cell near the outer wall. It was sparse, a plank bench, a coarse blanket, the single candle stub I was allowed each evening. The guard on duty, Petrov, stood just outside the door and did not meet my eyes. I sat on the bench and counted the simple facts. The sound of distant footsteps, the scrape of a broom against the yard stones, the metallic clink when a door latched. Each sound marked time. I unwrapped my hand to see the imprints of the straps. My fingers were raw. I ran a thumb along the scar on my jaw, recalling the scrape that had put it there years ago when I had tried to hold a prisoner steady for a surgeon. Again an outside event. The door to the passage banged and the court clerk slipped a sealed docket through the slit. He did not look at me. The paper listed fines and official note. Keys confiscated, punitive reassignment pending. That sheet of paper was cold and exact. It described the material change to my life. I thought of Marek's thread. I thought of the white loop against his palm. Objects alter the world in this tribunal. A scrap of cloth, a thin thread, a ring of brass. They become proof or they become evidence, and the tribunal chooses which. I recorded what remained in a small, private ledger of my own. I wrote with a stub of carbon on a scrap of paper. The time, the names involved, what I had done. Writing is a physical act, the pressure of the pen into paper, the smell of ink. I folded the sheet and slid it into the welt of the mattress where it would not be seen by casual search. I did not write to be absolved. I wrote because a man must place the record of his hands somewhere when the official record is shaped by others. At dusk the guard on the corridor passed a tray with bread and watery stew. He set it down and said, "Petrov sends his orders. No visitors, no work detail for a week." He my name once and then walked off without announcing it to the corridor. The action confirmed the new order. Removed privileges, removed trust. A surprising moment followed. That night, a faint knock came at the small slit to the cell. It was Havel, the clerk. He slid in a thin packet, an extra ration of bread and a folded strip of paper with a single sentence. "You did not break the man who mattered." He did not sign it. That anonymous line changed how I understood pieces of the tribunal. The clerk had not risked his ledger for me, but he had risked a minute of kindness. This was a twist. A secondary character who altered the moral texture of the aftermath through a small action. I ate the bread with my fingers. I tasted salt and saw the cramped handwriting once more in my mind. The cell's candle guttered and threw a small ring of light against the wall. I listened to the night steps recede and to the distant clang of a lock closing. My hands trembled less when I moved them now. The trimmer was steadier, less raw. The final inventory of the yard was concrete. The commander's notation in the ledger, Petrov's clipped salutes, Havel's secret ration, Marek's thread tied in a small knot and placed in the pocket of my tunic by an unseen hand. The last was not an accident. Someone had slipped the thread into my tunic while I slept. It was a fact that would be noticed, recorded, explained away, or not. In the morning the commander summoned me. He stood with baton and ledger. You will be moved to the outer watch. Your keys are forfeit. You will perform the duties reserved for those without trust. Understand. He spoke each word like a verdict. I understand, I said. I kept my face neutral. The words were accurate and minimal. I had not been given the option to bargain. My acceptance was an action of measurement, a man taking stock. He paused then and lowered the baton a fraction. Without looking at me, do not mistake this. Mercy is not a cloak. It is a weakness dressed as compassion. The yard cannot stand weakness. The statement was not an argument, but a doctrine laid down. I left the tribunal with my hands unkeyed, but with a small object sewn into my tunic pocket, Marek's white thread. The thread was a material proof that contradicted a doctrine. It was a token of gratitude and also a record of risk. Outside, the yard resumed its rhythm. Men took up tools. The sun found the damp spots on the stones and dried them into lighter patches. I walked past the place where the work detail had halted the morning before. The plank still bore the scar of a dropped hammer. I paused and ran a finger along the wood's mark. It was an ordinary thing, but it tied the morning to everything that followed. The chapter ends with a concrete beat. The court clerk Havel approached me at the outer gate, placed his hand on my shoulder, and slid a sealed slip into my palm that read, "For when the ledger fails." He did not speak. His hand was warm. His fingers smelled faintly of ink. That slip and the thread in my pocket were not salvation. They were records, small, human, and stubborn. They testified to the fact that I had chosen a hand over a rule, and that the tribunal had punished me by taking the simplest things. Keys, privilege, and the illusion of belonging. Outside the gate, a guard banged the latch closed behind me. The sound echoed and then settled. My keys were gone. My belt hung empty. I stood on the yard stones and felt the scab along my collarbone rub against my tunic. The last external event was the gate closing. It was a final, physical note on what the tribunal had accomplished. I will carry the thread and the ledger. I will carry the bruise and the stain where the baton hit bone. I will carry Marek's whispered thank you. The yard has its doctrine, and it will continue. But there are records not in their ledger. There are small, material acts, unlocked straps, a bread crust slid through a slit, a thread hidden in a pocket, that alter how a man moves forward. They do not topple institutions overnight, they complicate them. The yard emptied. Men resumed their tasks. Petrov walked by with a look precise and controlled. Havel returned to his clerk's chest. Marek disappeared down the corridor, a body reduced again to a number and to a thread. I sat on the bench in the outer watch and ran my thumb over the small knot of white thread in my pocket until the knot loosened a fraction. The action was deliberate. The final situational beat is not reflection but the concrete sound that brought this chapter to a close. A key turned in a distant lock, not mine, but the sound of the world continuing as it always had. The lock clicked, the gate swung, and the yard's doctrine remained standing while my choice was recorded in bruises, missing keys, and small, hidden tokens.